My name is Elise Hargrove, and the night my daughter was born, I was alone in a hospital room in Northern Virginia. No hand to hold, no voice on the phone, no one in the waiting room with my name written on a piece of paper. I was 23 years old, 4 centimeters dilated, and the only person in that building who knew what I was about to do next. 3 weeks earlier, I had sat across from the mother of my child's father in a pale limestone sitting room and listened to her offer me money to disappear. 2 weeks before that, I had sat across from my own parents at a candlelit bistro in Georgetown and listened to my father, a chief financial officer, a man who understood leverage better than almost anyone, tell me I was on my own. Both of those conversations were mistakes. Not mine. Theirs. Because what none of them understood, what they could not have understood, because they had never taken me seriously enough to study me, was that I had already been preparing for exactly this moment for 6 weeks before they delivered their ultimatums. By the time they told me I had nothing, I already had everything I needed. I had the documents. I had the attorney. I had the evidence. And I had the kind of cold, careful patience that comes from spending 18 months reading the legal architecture that wealthy families build around themselves and learning line by line exactly where those structures had gaps. They abandoned me. I built a life they will never touch. And the door that closes at the end of this story, I'm the one who shut it. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where we tell quiet, true-to-life family stories about boundaries, dignity, and the moment someone finally stopped shrinking to fit a seat they were never offered. If you've ever had to earn your place at your own family's table, this one is for you. Drop a comment below and be sure to subscribe. The Hargrove family home in McLean, Virginia, was the kind of house that was designed to impress people before they ever walked through the door. A federal-style colonial with deep green shutters, a circular driveway lined with imported river birch trees, and a foyer that always smelled of fresh-cut lilies and furniture polish. The housekeeper, Marta, arrived every morning before 7 to make sure every surface looked the way my mother needed it to look, like a photograph, like a curated life, like proof that the Hargroves had made exactly the right choices at every important junction. My father, Raymond Hargrove, was the chief financial officer of Crestline Capital, a mid-market private equity firm that managed roughly $3 billion in assets across the Southeast. He was the kind of man who could quote the trailing P/E ratio of any S&P 500 component, name every managing partner at every major firm in Washington, and recall the yield on a 10-year Treasury note without checking his phone. He could not tell you what I was studying in college until I was a junior and told him myself at dinner, at which point he nodded once, slowly, the way you acknowledge a footnote you don't expect to need again. My mother, Carol, was a former development director at a prominent arts nonprofit. She had spent years perfecting the particular talent of making every social interaction feel warm and personal while simultaneously advancing some invisible agenda. She remembered the names of spouses, children, and family pets of every person in their network. She forgot my college roommate's name 3 times in one semester. But she remembered the Whitmore family's entire extended genealogy going back 2 generations, because the Whitmores were the kind of family my mother had spent her adult life moving toward. I graduated summa cum laude from the University of Virginia with a double major in finance and pre-law. I went directly into the paralegal track at Hendricks and Moore, one of the most respected trust and estate law firms in Northern Virginia, while I studied for the LSAT. My plan had always been the bar. My parents had a different plan for me, though neither of them was ever honest enough to say it out loud. Their plan had a name, Lawrence Whitmore III. The Whitmore family was old Virginia money, not the technology corridor kind, not the real estate flip generation, but the kind of wealth that appears in the footnotes of state history books. Tobacco, then timber, then banking, then a diversified holding company that stretched from commercial real estate in Richmond to a portfolio of healthcare facilities across 3 Appalachian states. Lawrence was 31, a Darden MBA, with custom-tailored shirts from a London clothier and the smooth, unhurried confidence of a man who had never once been told that something he wanted was unavailable to him. I met him at a fundraiser my mother had organized. He was charming in exactly the way that men who have never experienced real consequences are always charming. Fluent in flattery, completely unpracticed in accountability. We dated for 11 months. I was careful about everything. He was careless about one thing. When I discovered I was pregnant at 8 weeks, I did not panic. I had grown up in a household where emotion was treated as a liability, where the appropriate response to any difficult situation was to process the information first and feel it later. I went to my OB, received confirmation, sat in the parking garage of Inova Fairfax Hospital for 14 minutes, and then drove home and opened a legal pad. I wrote down a list of questions. Not emotional questions, strategic ones. What are my legal rights under Virginia family law? What constitutes a legally binding promise of financial support? What documentation do I currently possess that establishes the nature and extent of this relationship? I had, without ever planning it, been preparing for exactly this moment for 18 months. Because what I did every day at Hendricks and Moore was read the legal architecture that wealthy families build to protect themselves from obligations they'd rather not honor. Paternity agreements, contested estate distributions, disputed property claims. I had processed hundreds of them. I knew the playbook. I had read it in the handwriting of their own attorneys. And I knew, before Lawrence did, before his mother did, before my own father even understood what was happening, that I was holding considerably more leverage than any of them realized. I said nothing about any of this. I made an appointment. I took a personal day, and I drove out to the Whitmore Estate in Great Falls. The Whitmore Estate sat on 9 acres behind a black iron gate with a keypad entry system. Code 0419, Patricia Whitmore's birthday, which Lawrence had given me 10 months into our relationship with the easy casualness of a man who never imagined it would someday matter. The main house was a Georgian revival, 3 stories of pale limestone with tall windows and a formal garden in the back that Lawrence's grandmother had designed in 1961. It was beautiful the way very powerful, very cold things are beautiful. Impressive from a distance, uncomfortable up close. Patricia Whitmore was waiting in the front sitting room when I arrived. Not Lawrence. Patricia. She was 62, silver-haired, and wearing a charcoal blazer over cream trousers. The kind of outfit that says I did not dress up for this meeting, and also that I did not have to. She had the permanent, composed expression of a woman who had spent 4 decades winning arguments by never visibly entering them. She offered me tea. I declined. I sat down across from her on a cream linen chair, placed my hands in my lap, and waited. I had learned, in deposition preparation coaching at the firm, that silence is never your enemy in a negotiation. The party who feels compelled to fill a quiet room is the party who has already begun to concede. Patricia filled it within 20 seconds. Lawrence is traveling, she began, but he felt it was important that we speak. As a family. She paused on the word family in a way that made its exclusion of me perfectly clear. We think very highly of you, Elise. Your parents have raised a remarkable young woman. But this situation, she stopped, reached for her tea, set it down without drinking. This situation creates complications for everyone involved. She looked at me with something I can only describe as elegant, practiced sympathy. Lawrence has obligations. Succession structures, relationships with investors and partners that go back 3 generations. An unplanned child creates legal and financial entanglements that the family's counsel has advised us are best resolved quietly and efficiently. We have a figure in mind, a one-time arrangement, handled through the Family Foundation's legal office, no public record. You would sign a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement, waive any future claims on the estate, and the child would have no claim on Whitmore Holdings or any related entity. I said nothing for a moment. I counted the panes in the tall window to my left. 8. I counted the book spines on the shelf behind Patricia's head. 22. I counted my own heartbeats. 12. Steady. Then I asked what the figure was. She named a number that was not small. It was also, in the context of what Lawrence stood to inherit from a family holding company, I had spent 3 evenings reconstructing from public filings and county property records approximately 1/5 of 1% of his projected net estate. I thank her for her time. I stood. I smoothed the front of my blazer, a mirror gesture entirely deliberate, and I walked to the door. At the threshold, I turned back. I'll have my attorney reach out to yours this week, I said. I'd recommend they prepare for a more comprehensive conversation than you may be expecting. Patricia's smile did not waver, but her hand, resting on the arm of the chair, tightened. I noticed it. I noticed everything. That same evening, my parents asked me to dinner. Not at home. At Solon's, a new French-American bistro in Georgetown where the breadbasket cost $12 and the lighting made everyone look like they had made excellent life choices. My father was already on his second glass of Barolo when I arrived. My mother had ordered the appetizers. They were warm. They smiled. They did not ask how I was feeling. My father set down his wine glass and said, very quietly, "Patricia called us this afternoon." He used the word generous twice in a single sentence about how much money it would cost to erase my child from a family's future. And frankly, Elise, if you make this adversarial, it reflects on all of us. It reflects on me at Crestline. The Whitmores have relationships with 2 of our limited partners. Do you understand what I'm telling you? I understood perfectly. My father was not concerned about my welfare. He was concerned about 2 LP relationships and a seat on a charitable advisory board. My mother reached across the table and put her hand over mine. She said, "We love you." And I believe in the way she was capable of that she meant it. But we can't go to war with the Whitmore family. It isn't wise. It isn't who we are. I looked at her hand on mine. Her diamond anniversary ring caught the candlelight. I thought about how she had spent an entire year lobbying for me to attend every Whitmore family event, coaching me on what to wear, reminding me to laugh at Lawrence's jokes, steering me toward a role in someone else's family structure while doing nothing to protect me inside our own. "I'm not going to sign the NDA," I said. "My attorney will be in contact with Whitmore Holdings Counsel by the end of the week." The silence at the table had a texture to it, like the moment before a structure gives way. My father set down his fork. "Then you're on your own," he said. He said it without cruelty, without raising his voice. He delivered it the way he would deliver the closing line of a quarterly earnings report, a fact stated cleanly over roasted duck. I folded my napkin, left $400 in cash on the table for the bill, and walked out into the night. I did not cry until I reached my car, and even then, it was only for a few minutes, because I had work to do. What Lawrence Whitmore and his family did not know, what my own father, for all his financial acumen, somehow failed to anticipate, was that I had not arrived at any of those conversations unprepared. 3 weeks before Patricia's sitting room offer and my father's term sheet dismissal, I had sat down with Marcus Ellison in his K Street office and laid a thick manila folder on his desk. Marcus was 57, former assistant counsel of the Federal Reserve, and had spent the last 2 decades doing one thing with extraordinary precision: protecting the legal rights of women whose wealthy partners had assumed the law wouldn't bother to show up on their behalf. I gave him Exhibit First. It was a printed transcript with timestamps of a series of text messages in which Lawrence had explicitly stated, over the course of our 11-month relationship, that he intended to provide for our future together, that he wasn't going anywhere, and that he was serious about this. But the most critical piece of Exhibit A was a voice memo. I had recorded a private conversation between Lawrence and myself during a weekend in October, legally permissible under Virginia's one-party consent statute, in which Lawrence said, in his own voice, with no ambiguity, "Whatever you need, Elise. You and the baby. That's my responsibility. I want to do right by this." Marcus looked up from the transcript and said, "He said this voluntarily?" I told him Lawrence had said it 3 times in the same conversation. I handed Marcus the full audio file on a USB drive. Exhibit B was a property matter. 10 months into our relationship, Lawrence had added my name as a secondary signatory on a personal bank account he maintained for household expenses, a joint account in the formal legal sense, which held, at its peak, approximately $340,000. He had done this with the casual ease of a man who never imagines anything will require documentation. When he removed my access to that account, 3 days after I told him I was pregnant, which I could prove through account activity timestamps, he had executed what Marcus described as a potentially actionable unilateral modification of a joint financial arrangement in direct response to a protected event, my pregnancy. That distinction mattered significantly under Virginia law. Exhibit C was the most structurally complex piece and the one I was most proud of finding. Through my work at Hendricks & Moore, I had developed a working familiarity with the Whitmore family's corporate structure, not from privileged client information, which I was careful never to access, but from publicly filed documents. Whitmore Holdings LLC had submitted 3 operating agreements to the Virginia State Corporation Commission over the previous 5 years. 2 of those agreements contained a piece of language, standard, boilerplate text that their in-house counsel had clearly copy-pasted from a template without adequate review, that described lineal descendants of Lawrence Whitmore III as qualified distributive interest holders in certain operating entities. In plain English, any biological child of Lawrence Whitmore had a codified legal pathway to claim a distributive interest in the operating company's quarterly distributions. Not the primary estate, not the bulk of the trust, but a meaningful, legally defensible portion of the company's ongoing income, an amount that, annualized, would comfortably fund a child's education, health care, and housing for life. Marcus had spent 2 weeks reviewing this language with a co-counsel specializing in Virginia LLC law. His assessment was unambiguous. The language was enforceable. The Whitmore family's own attorneys had written Lawrence's future child directly into the operating agreement. They had simply never imagined it would be a child whose mother had been quietly reading their filings for 18 months. Exhibit D was the most personal and the most careful. I had submitted a formal inquiry through Marcus with no direct connection to my name to the Virginia Department of Professional and Occupational Regulation. The inquiry concerned a licensed financial advisor named Gerald Pratt who had, for over a decade, been channeling investment referrals to Crestline Capital, my father's firm, in exchange for an undisclosed percentage-based arrangement. I had found this buried in a compliance footnote of one of Crestline's limited partnership agreements, which are publicly available through an SEC filing audit from 2019. I had not fabricated or embellished a single detail. I had simply noticed something that should have been noticed years earlier and reported it through the proper channel. Marcus noted carefully that the existence of this inquiry and my quiet knowledge of it gave certain parties a significant incentive to resolve our matter quickly, on terms favorable to my daughter. Marcus filed our initial demand letter to Whitmore Holdings General Counsel on a Tuesday morning in October. By Thursday afternoon, they had retained outside litigation counsel. By the following Monday, that counsel called Marcus and asked, in the time-honored language of people who have suddenly realized they made a serious miscalculation, what would take to resolve this matter. Marcus told them, with characteristic calm, that we were not trying to resolve anything. We were trying to establish what was right. The negotiations lasted 11 weeks. I gave birth to my daughter, Clara, in the middle of week 4. I negotiated the final settlement terms from my hospital room during week 9 on a laptop while Clara slept in the bassinet beside me. My maternity leave was not restful in the conventional sense, but it was the most productive 11 weeks of my professional life. The settlement included a formal legal acknowledgement of Lawrence's paternity, a structured annual distribution from Whitmore Holdings' operating entity to a custodial trust established in Clara's name, guaranteed through her 25th birthday, access to the Whitmore family's private healthcare network for Clara's primary medical needs, and a confidentiality provision that ran in both directions equally. Mutual idea, not the one-sided erasure they had originally proposed in that pale limestone sitting room. An equal and permanent silence on entirely equal terms. Patricia Whitmore's personal attorney called Marcus after the signing to ask, off the record, how I had known about the operating agreement language. Marcus told him simply. She read, "As for my father, the DPR inquiry into Gerald Pratt's undisclosed referral arrangement resulted in a formal regulatory investigation. Crestline Capital's Compliance Committee placed my father on administrative leave pending an internal review. He resigned 14 weeks later. The firm settled with the SEC for an undisclosed amount the following spring. My father's name appeared in a single paragraph of a FINRA enforcement bulletin that approximately 12 people read in full. I was one of them. Clara is 4 years old now. She has her great-grandmother's eyes, a dark, watchful brown that seems to already be cataloging the world, and her mother's preference for sitting quietly in the middle of loud rooms, just watching and waiting and noticing things that other people miss. She likes bored books about animals and asks why about everything. She is, without any exaggeration, the most clear-thinking person I have ever shared a home with. I passed the Virginia bar exam when Clara was 14 months old. I sat for it with a travel pack of animal crackers in my bag because she had refused to eat breakfast, and I had managed to get one sleeve of goldfish crackers into her before the babysitter arrived. I passed on my first attempt. I now practice trust and estate law at a firm of my own founding, Hargrove Ellison Associates, named in partnership with Marcus, who became first my mentor and eventually my equal. We have 7 attorneys, a paralegal team of 4, and a practice that specializes in exactly the kind of case I once was, women with legally enforceable claims against wealthy families who have made the comfortable assumption that the law simply won't bother. The Whitmore estate in Great Falls was listed on the market 18 months after our settlement. The listing price was $4.2 million. It sold after 63 days for $3.85 million. Patricia moved to a condominium in Reston. Lawrence married a woman from a Dallas family with oil money and a prenuptial agreement that is, from what Marcus has heard through professional channels, extraordinarily comprehensive on her side. I did not find either piece of news satisfying exactly. I found it simply true, the natural, downstream consequence of a family that had, for generations, confused power with permanence. My parents sold the McLean Colonial 2 years ago. My mother called when it went on the market. It was the first time we had spoken in over a year. She said she wanted me to know. I thanked her. There was a silence between us on the line that neither of us filled, and then she asked if Clara was well. I said she was. We said goodbye. I stood at my kitchen window for a long time after that call, watching the light move across the backyard where Clara was drawing with sidewalk chalk on the patio. Big, looping shapes she announced were horses, and I felt something I'm still working to name precisely. It was not forgiveness exactly. It was not grief. It was something closer to the feeling you get when a long, complicated book finally closes. A sense of completion and the faint, clean recognition that you survived it. There is something that people rarely talk about when they tell stories like mine, which is that grief and justice can exist in the same room without canceling each other out. I am not celebrating the dissolution of my parents' financial life. I am not satisfied by what happened to my father's career. What I am is free. Free in a way I could not have understood at 23 in that hospital room. Because freedom of that depth is not imaginable until you're standing fully inside it. I do not require my parents' approval to feel worthy. I do not require Lawrence Whitmore's acknowledgement to know that my daughter deserves the resources she was legally entitled to from the moment she took her first breath. I do not require anyone's validation of choices I made alone, in silence, when every person who was supposed to be in my corner decided their comfort mattered more than my dignity. I built a life they cannot touch. Not because I wanted revenge. Revenge as a goal is too small and too temporary for the amount of energy it requires. But because when they told me I was on my own, I had the presence of mind to believe them completely and the skill to make that mean something entirely different than they had intended. They meant, you are alone, and therefore you are helpless. What it turned out to mean was, you are unencumbered, and therefore you are free. Clara does not yet know the full story. She knows that her father lives in another city, and that she has a trust that will be hers when she's older. She knows that her mother is an attorney, and that attorneys help people figure out what they're rightfully owed. She knows that our apartment has bookshelves along every wall, and that we read together every night before she goes to sleep. She knows she is loved completely, unconditionally, without contract or clause or the threat of withdrawal. That knowledge is worth more than any asset on any balance sheet I have ever reviewed. When she asks me someday, and she will ask because she notices everything, why she doesn't see her grandparents very often on either side, I will tell her the truth in the gentlest way I know how. I will tell her that some people love the way they love a useful thing, well and warmly when it serves a purpose, and poorly when it becomes inconvenient. And that learning to recognize that kind of love and to refuse to mistake it for the real thing is one of the most important lessons she will ever receive. I will also tell her this, that the night she was born, her mother sat alone in a hospital room and made herself one single promise. And she kept it. If someone in your life only values you when you're useful to them, take this as your sign. Stop auditioning for a seat you already deserve. You don't need their approval to build something they can never take from you. Share this with someone who needs to hear it tonight. Drop a comment below, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.